Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing of the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast. This is episode number 98. We are live with some web components experts we've had on before. We have Trey Shugart, and we have Rob Dodson.
Hey.
And a new guest, we have Tim Perry.
Hello.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm a software developer for a company called Softwire in the UK. I actually work remotely out here from Barcelona. We do bespoke development for pretty much everybody, so people like BBC and Cisco and loads of other people, and pretty much everything. So web apps, server infrastructure, mobile apps. The lot. So I tech lead projects over there. I've been there for a few years doing all of that. And I also run our open source program, and I've also done a bunch of open source, such as server components, which we're going to be talking about today.
Nice. So web components on the server or server-side rendered web components. It's an interesting subject we'll be talking about today. And on our panel, we have Danny Blue.
Hello, everybody.
Justin Ribeiro. And myself.
Hello, wonderful people. Hey, good to see everybody out there today.
Oh, yeah. So this is probably the biggest, the largest hangout we've done in a while.
A meeting of minds, one might say.
Yes. Before we get started, I would like to do a shout-out to one of our fans, Silas, who's a 5-year-old, I think, in Canada. Just wanted to say thanks for listening.
We are assuming our youngest fan.
Yes, assuming.
Listener. He didn't say he was a fan. Listener.
Listener, that is true. Although,
yeah, I don't know that my kids are a fan, so you know, you have to ease them into this web development thing. I think that's the key.
That's true. That's true. I did have somebody come in for an interview yesterday, though, and they were like, "Hey, you're that podcast guy," and they started quoting like some of the podcasts, and I was like a little creeped out.
That's awesome. No, that's amazing.
But it was pretty cool, though. It's pretty cool and creepy and awesome. So to start out, a lot of people, when we talk about server-side web components, or I talk about it at least, or one of you guys, I get like blank stares. Like people are like, wait a minute, these are DOM APIs, and you're talking about a server. So what are we really talking about here? What the heck are these things?
Okay, so server components themselves are a fairly new library that I started maybe a month, 2 months ago, something like this. So it's fairly early stages, and it's HTML rendering on the server using the same web components API. So we're taking the same structures, same approach that you've got going on there, but moving that so that you can run it in an entirely simulated DOM in Node.
And is this anything like Angular Universal or the React setups where you have server-side rendering, or is it something different?
So I think there's a fairly large difference in approach, really. All of those every single one of those options really is trying to provide a client-side JavaScript approach, trying to provide generally quite large frameworks to build complicated and very dynamic web applications, and then trying to optimize on top of that to add server-side rendering to get SEO and initial render benefits, improve accessibility, this kind of thing, and get all of that as an extension on top of the standard client-side approach, whereas server components really is designed primarily to work entirely without any client-side logic. So you just render a page and you're done, and then to make it easy to progressively enhance that on top. So it's coming in from the other direction, really.
I think also an important distinction would be is that Tim's library is leveraging the custom elements like web standard, whereas I don't think Angular Universal does. I'm pretty sure React does not. So both of those Angular and React would be sort of stamping out sort of the existing DOM elements, right? So you'd write a component, but it ending up being a bunch of divs and things like that. Whereas Tim's thing is you're writing a custom element, and then it's stamping out whatever sort of maybe template it might have. But that's to me that's the big distinction, is it's leveraging that spec under the hood.
Yeah, and we know you from Polymer and Polycast and Web Components, Rob, and we have Trey, who's been working on SkateJS with custom elements in that, and soon to be some ShadowDom from what I've seen in a separate library. If I'm mistaken, you can just correct me and say stop. But
that's correct.
But so what I'm saying is here we have 3 separate library maintainers. What are the use cases, the applications that you guys have heard of for building with these type of web components?
Specifically, like server components, or for just web components in general.
So if I'm building out an application, why would I bother doing declarative HTML or anything like that inside of a server, or why would I do pre-rendering of custom elements versus like something like the divs in React or Angular?
Yeah, so I guess there's like a few things. In general, like why would you use custom elements? I think is because they're standards-based, which is good, especially if you're in kind of a large organization. It can be very difficult to get everyone on one framework, and so the nice thing, just starting from the baseline of why you would use web components, is because you can build these components, and hopefully everyone can use them regardless of the framework that they're leveraging, or they could just build an app entirely out of those components. There are still some areas where there is like a bit of mismatch with the existing frameworks of today when it comes to using web components, but that's sort of the long-term goal, is that they work everywhere. As for like why you would do it server side, there's a few different, I guess, I mean, I would say the jury is still out on some of these things, but there's a few different perceived benefits. The first is time to first paint, right? Like just getting something on screen faster, and hopefully if you can stamp out your template and inline your CSS, you might be drawing and painting faster, which could improve the user experience. And then I think there's also this perception of an SEO benefit, possibly, from having as much of your application rendered server-side before it comes down to the client. And that is one of those areas where I think maybe the science is still out just a little bit. I'm not at all an SEO expert, but one of the things that I do know that at least the Google search team has announced in the past few months, maybe almost like a year ago at this point, is that when you send down your application, the crawler does run a bit of JavaScript on the page. So you've got sort of a window there where if you did have a client-side framework, it would have time to boot up and things like that. So that's one of those areas where I'm still not sure the SEO benefit of server render. Back in the day, that was a big deal for people, was doing something like that.
And that was around 2015, I think, and I've been looking into this at Carfax with the web components and things like that as well. Do you think that if there's JavaScript off on your page, right, you turn it off? My understanding is that the Google bots will still see the JavaScript and parse it up to a certain time frame, like within a certain amount of time for preload. Is that correct? Would you say, or you don't? Is it top secret Google stuff?
I mean, I can tell you what I saw on you can look it up. There's like a Google Webmasters blog post, and I think they do maybe mention in there that there's sort of like a window of time. Like it's not going to just like infinitely run JavaScript on your page. Like there will be some cutoff where it's like, okay, like I'm done parsing. But as for how long that window is, I don't know. That's the Google secret sauce that they don't even tell fellow Googlers.
Magic.
It's magic, yeah.
And I mean, most of that stuff indexes now. I mean, at least in my limited testing. I mean, we've got production sites out there now based on web components that are indexing just fine. But there is something to be said for server rendering from a user speed perspective too. There is an opportunity for a solid mix that gives users better web performance beyond just, obviously our crawlers and the things that we want to reach out to.
Yeah, I think one of the tricky bits is, as Paul Lewis has mentioned on Twitter before, is this idea of the uncanny valley, where you send down something and it renders, but it requires JavaScript interactive, and so you can't actually like click on it. And so I'll even like call out one of our own products. So Inbox, I think maybe, I don't know if they're doing server render or what they're doing exactly, but if you use Inbox for your email, sometimes you can actually see the page and you go to like click on an email and the JavaScript hasn't booted up yet, and you can't actually like read your email, and you're like, I hate this, right? So you have to be careful there too, right? It gives a perceived performance benefit sometimes. You could actually then end up accidentally degrading the user experience because someone's like, I can't use this thing. Is it broken, right? Like they're now questioning their sanity and stuff, and so there's a balancing act there, I think.
I think for us, I echo a lot of what Rob said, but it seems like there's no real SEO problem or accessibility problem from what I've seen, that screen readers kind of tend to read the ShadowDom. I think if you have like an app and you have it encapsulated in a single custom element and that renders it out into a ShadowDom, then something like this can be like really useful if it renders out that ShadowDom, because then that gets to the page immediately. So there's no like flash of unstyled content, or if something doesn't execute JavaScript on the page, then it's there for it to see and to crawl or whatever. So I think a lot of like usefulness for me, a lot of that depends on what happens with the ShadowDom. I think that's an open question that's still going to be answered here.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed issues with like LD-JSON. Like, if you can technically, like if you read sort of the webmaster guidelines, you can inject it dynamically, but in the ShadowDom state, it doesn't seem to quite work correctly if you've got stuff shifting around in a main sort of application tag. So there are issues to work out for sure as we sort of define the best practices sort of in the sort of web components world, whether that's on server-side rendering or just on the matter of the client.
Yeah, and also I would just point out, I don't think you necessarily always have to use ShadowDom either. This is something that I've been kind of getting more into these days, is being very, very selective about the use of ShadowDom for a couple of reasons. Like, one, I think it's a little bit easier to onboard people to web components if you just start with custom elements. And they're like, oh, cool, okay, well, I get what I'm doing here. Like, I'm basically making like a super-powered jQuery plugin almost. I'm creating a new tag, but I'm still using all the same styling that I would before. And I don't have to do the thing where I'm like selecting a div and passing it to like a factory function to like fill it with functionality or anything like that. So I think that's a nice onboard for people. And then for the server-side render side of things, right now, there's no shadow DOM or shadow root tag, so it's hard to do that declaratively server-side. So I believe Tim's library just uses vanilla custom elements, if I'm not mistaken. And so what you can do there is you could take a vanilla custom element, stamp out its template, use them or whatever you would normally use for just like styling your own kind of components, and send that down to the page. And so that's an approach I've been actually pretty interested in seeing more people explore. I think with Polymer, we kind of coupled them all together, ShadowDom, custom elements, and everything, which is like fun and it's really awesome, but it does make some of these other things like server render a bit tricky.
Yeah, for server components, custom elements is definitely where the magic happens. And I've looked a bit at ShadowDom, but particularly on the server side, you're not getting the kind of layout and styling benefits that you're getting from being able to isolate CSS. So you don't really care about it that much. It's just being able to isolate those DOM trees. And without that benefit, there's much less value to it. And in that first initial render, it's quite easy to just stick stuff together and ship it out without.
Yeah, I suppose you could do partial encapsulation using like an immediately invoked function, like closure of some type.
Yeah, one thing.
Styling.
Yeah, not necessarily for the styling, although one thing I have seen is people sort of float the idea of like you could simulate ShadowDom using template elements, because they also create their own little document scope, and maybe you could build some sort of library that does like a crazy switcheroo client side and replaces the template tags with like creating shadow roots where they were and then piping the content into them. But honestly, that feels like a lot of work with, I don't know if it would have a lot of payoff. So I really like Tim's approach of just focusing on vanilla custom elements and really trying to like kind of nail that story first. And ShadowDom is a cool technology, but I think we're still trying to figure out just like where it slots in, where it's best used, and everything, you know.
So would we maybe say that ShadowDom isn't exactly where we need it to be yet. I only bring this up because of reasons kind of like you said, like Polymer kind of tries to group all of them together, and it's really great. But you can build an application with just custom elements and and nothing else. You don't need all of the other parts of the spec to do stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's potential upsides to ShadowDom around CSS performance. If you're building like for being able to almost like contain some of the layouty stuff, I think. And I think if you were just building an entirely client-side app and you weren't concerned about server render, then sure, like go ahead and use it and everything. But if it's making your life difficult, right? If it feels like an impediment, then I would say, just like skip it and leverage custom elements, right? Focus on that first, right? Try and because again, I think that's sort of the biggest win of web components is custom elements, and then figure out where ShadowDom like works with the way that you want to build. I think I'm happy with where like styling has got, and I'm happy with where the specs have got. But I think so. I think the implementation is kind of where I want it to be. But I think what we're still figuring out is basically best practices and best ways to use it.
So on the implementation front, though, it's in Chrome. I don't know if V1 is updated though. If it's been updated to the next.
That will be coming out in Chrome 53, I believe, is the V1.
Okay, and Firefox has the open bug still, and Edge says by the end of the year, right?
They're working on it, yeah. And Safari, the big one is Safari shipped it in Safari 10. The nice thing about that is that polyfilling ShadowDom in particular was always the really, really, really expensive thing to do when it came to web components, in particular on mobile.
Yeah.
And so with both Safari and Chrome for Android shipping ShadowDom, that is a huge burden lifted for folks, especially if they want to use ShadowDom and they still need to maybe polyfill it for other browsers like Edge or something like that. They could even go back to using the old classic ShadowDom polyfill, which is very spec compliant, but also very slow and expensive because running it on a desktop is not so bad. And then on mobile, you would just be getting the native thing, which would be kind of cool. So that might help like framework interop and things like that.
Yeah, from our experience, polyfilling stuff in WebKit is pretty painful because of the get own property descriptor issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, the performance in general is pretty hard on mobile WebKit.
Yeah, but it's all going away. It's all going to be magically better.
Notably, this is also something that gets really nice with server rendering. If you want to server-side add ShadowDom, you don't have to worry about lots of the complexities of trying to polyfill it. You're not trying to hook into WebKit. You're trying to hook into some DOM simulation, which is just a JavaScript library that you want to hook into. You don't have to worry about things like the complexities of managing, trying to hook into layout and the extra costs that browsers are going to add to DOM nodes in these cases. The objects are comparatively lightweight. It's much easier to build that sort of stuff in on that side.
So in your library, Tim, that you have the server-side components, do you have like if you render it and it gets to the browser, are you able to redefine that element, like to upgrade?
So yes, I've only got some proof of concepts of this. Again, the kind of core goal for it is to stay on the server side and then progressively enhance rather than actively chasing doing the client side stuff. But it does actually work quite nicely. You register the elements on the server side and then on the client side you have some JavaScript, potentially exactly the same JavaScript, if you can manage to find a good isomorphic setup, which is a bit tricky but doable. And then you register that on the server side, you register it on the client side, and it just runs again against the same elements with essentially the same DOM and renders whatever it likes. The isomorphic libraries part is the tricky bit, coming up with something that will happily work exactly the same when you make the same call on the server and on the client. It's tricky. Things like Ajax calls obviously have a different, but you're not going to have the same API by and large. And there are some libraries that will give you hooks to do that, but not most of them.
Yeah, that's something I know. If you watch Adi Osmani's talk from past Google I/O, where he talked about building progressive web apps in different frameworks and using their server-side rendering libraries, that was something he ran into too, where he needed to use sort of like a universal Ajax kind of thing. He couldn't just like do what he wanted client side. So there are libraries that sort of paper those things over, which is nice.
It's getting there, yeah. The one I was looking at recently was trying to do server-side rendered maps, which is quite an interesting case. It's quite nice to be able to load up a page that has a map on it, and a map seems like something that in a lot of cases doesn't actually really need interactivity. You just want to show a map with a pointer on it. So it would be nice to just do that server-side, but if you wanted to use Leaflet, say, Leaflet expects there to be window and document globals and stuff. And that gets quite tricky, and you have to wrap it as you load it, basically, and start injecting those in. And it's doable, but it's fiddlier than it should be.
One of the things that I really like with the web components is the ShadowDom. I don't mean to go back and dwell too much on it, but the reason I like it is that the encapsulation you'd be able to share across applications. Like originally, what got me into web components was one of Rob's talks at like Cascadia JS, I believe. Before you worked at Google, Rob.
Yeah. Cascade SF, yeah.
And and I remember you talked about Bootstrap, and you talked about this whole idea of we have these components that you just drop in, and they work just like HTML elements in the way that they work. So if I were to take somebody else's, import them through a link or imperatively put them in, I could just change a few variables and change maybe a couple of things that would affect it, but I couldn't actually go in and monkey patch it, right? I mean, you can go into the code, but I think the advantage is if you have this clear public API, that makes it very easy to use across different apps. I know that's not the use case for everyone, but I think creating small, low-level elements like that is so important to avoid rewriting the wheel.
That's actually one of the reasons I originally brought it up, is because, Skate itself is based on incremental DOMs, so any virtual DOM that composes components together needs to hide those implementation details for each component's template or whatever it is. So when you get things like React integration or stuff like that happening, ShadowDom becomes really imperative in making everything work. But the suggestion earlier about maybe not using ShadowDom might apply for the top-level app, because you're not actually composing your app element, inside of another element. So maybe that can render out its stuff and not hide the stuff in the ShadowDom.
Yeah, and one of the areas too that's like I think still, again, why I said the jury is still out on some of the server render stuff is like one of the things the Polymer team has been trying to do is to figure out, do you need server render if you are leveraging things like H2 server push a little bit more intelligently, and you're able to get a lot of the stuff down to the client faster because the elements can maybe bootstrap really quickly. And so the shop demo that they built for I/O was kind of like specifically trying to like test that out. So they wanted something that could render really, really quickly, but they didn't have to do it server side. And I feel like they came up with like a really, really good project there and their whole purple pattern thing. But I think, again, H2 push is also still pretty new, and we're still trying to figure out what is the best way to use that. I think there's been some articles recently where people have been like, we use H2 server push, and our site got slower, So, but if you really, really like ShadowDom, I think there is still, I feel like this whole area just needs like us to kind of hack on it more and do more science, but it definitely does feel like there's still a lot of exploration to be like, I really like ShadowDom. If I can't do it server side, could I use H2 push to still get that similar performance that I want? And I think that is very, very possible.
As assuming we have a solid graceful degradation too, because HTTP2 is not on all of the browsers, all of the newer ones, I would say, but you still have like, it's actually on iOS, the latest, the past.
Oh yeah,
year.
I think you'd have to go back to like IE 9 and stuff like that, right? It's definitely not going to support it. So you also got to consider your market for sure.
Yeah, and 10 might even have Speedy. So I'm not sure, but yeah, to have a graceful fallback would be great. And I wonder, I saw Paul Kinlan from the Google team. He also he did a recent demo using WebTorrent with peer dependencies and our WebRTC. I wonder if you could leverage something like that to increase speed and synchronization that way.
Yeah, maybe. By the way, on the subject of the graceful fallback, I did want to mention this. So a browser that does support H2 will send a header, I believe, indicating that it supports H2. I can't remember the actual text of the header though, but it does send a little sort of indicator, which is why if you use like Polymer CLI or something like that, we actually produce bundled and unbundled versions of the final product. In case you need to, on your server, check that header and send down like the bundled version, or you could send down the unbundled version with server push or something. So I think it's totally possible and actually hopefully pretty straightforward to do this.
Okay.
Hey, so Tim, kind of trying to go back a little bit to the overall idea of these server-side components. Can you give us like a very quick, like top-down, how this thing that you wrote works? Because it doesn't seem like something that should work. So can you just very quickly?
Yeah.
No, sorry, Eric was waving, and I thought he was telling me to stop. I was like, oh God, what did I do? But yeah, but just really quick, like, how did you make this work? How did you make something that runs in your browser run on the server?
So it's actually astoundingly easy, or more accurately, other people have done all the hard work before. There's a DOM. There's quite a few DOM simulations for Node. I'm using Domino, which is quite good. I believe it's bought off some work from Zility did a while ago. I'm not actually sure. The other big ones are things like JS DOM and so on, and there's other similar libraries that instead use Phantom.js and Electron to actually run real WebKits. Doing it with Domino works quite well just because it gives you just a very, very simple model for an object. For a browser, you just say, I want a new document, I want to have this HTML, and it knows how to pass that, build the DOM nodes from that, and then follows the DOM standards pretty accurately. And the test suite included in Domino is actually just the standard test suites for browsers everywhere else, and goes through, happily simulates that, and then you just make normal JavaScript calls against it. So really the core work is just taking that DOM library, papering over the slight differences, like you don't have an easy window object available and so on, to pass stuff through and make it convenient, and polyfilling custom elements into it, more or less. And that's pretty much it.
Now that does sound way simpler than I think it seems it would be on the outset. What particular? But there must have been some particular challenges that you did run into while you were trying to make this work. Like, so can you recall what was the most difficult part about making it work? Just from the time of starting to getting like your Hello World custom element actually displaying on the page.
So I think there's two particular differences which end up making things fairly difficult with the structure of it. First is making the document available, conveniently passing that around. So to do this, I'm actually deviating slightly from the web component spec in that the created callbacks that you add on your component get past the document for each of them, so that you can dynamically pass them through, and then you need to pass those through to libraries that actually require them. So like I was talking about Leaflet before, I have a patched version of Leaflet that takes an explicit document, and there's lots of fiddling there, but it works out fairly nicely. The other tricky one is, and I think this is for server rendering generally, you have to work out when you're done. And with normal JavaScript, with normal custom elements, you can just re-render frequently and continue going through that. And you don't really have to have a finish point. But here, you've got to render something and really actually know when the page is ready to serve up to the users. So for this, custom elements uses promises. If you, from one of your created callback or whatever, return a promise, the whole rendering process will wait until all the promises are completed, and then at that point assume the HTML is done and serve it back up. So there's a bunch of work to hook in and detect whether you're passing stuff out in the right place and make sure everything waits nicely to bring that all together.
Cool. So since you are rendering these web components on the server side, is there potential for using custom elements for server work? I guess if that makes sense. So right now you're just kind of trying to create these custom elements, which are as close as you can get to the ones that you would write for your normal client-side custom elements. But is there also the possibility of kind of, like a declaratively configuring a server with elements? Does that, if something like that makes sense?
Yes. So you can do whatever you like, really. HTML here. As you go further and further down this path, you end up using HTML just as a way of describing a structure of stuff and then adding some semantic meaning as you go through. And as you diverge more and more from trying to describe the shape of a UI, I think that gets a bit weird when you lose the benefits, but it's certainly possible. There's another project that I've only had a quick skim through, but looks fairly interesting trying to do this. Express Web Components is the link I've got. And yeah, that is an HTML approach to defining an entire Express server. So you have a tag for Express server, a tag for the ports you want to listen to, this kind of thing. You declaratively hook everything together through that. That's kind of nice, but yeah, I think the main benefits are really doing it on the UI side, just because it maps so closely to what you're going to end up with, and it becomes this clearer transformation. It's easier to understand and maintain.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It is just interesting to see what people will do with something once it is possible. Once you can make something do something else, people are going to try to do it. So it's kind of fascinating that people are kind of playing around with some of that stuff. Because
it's definitely something you can do even on the client side as well. You see it a bit, people putting in tags to add extra kind of behavior to the page, but not really UI at all, and have weird side effects.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was thinking about, because you even think of like a lot of the Polymer elements in the catalog, like Ajax and Service Worker and things like that, don't add UI components, but they add other behaviors. So it is interesting that you can kind of take that same paradigm and you can make it work on the server side. Whether or not it's a good idea, I guess, is still out for debate. But it's still interesting.
I think it's inevitable that this sort of project would come about, though, because you look at React and how it handles. You can do declarative routes, right? In JSX, you can do like you said. We have on the client side, we have the app router in Polymer, which used to be Carbon router or whatever. But it's inevitable. I think people would think of these ideas. Jordan Last, I think, is the person who did that Express, and he has an organization, Scram.js, which has another one, Koa Elements, and a bunch. It's interesting stuff. It's not something I would have thought of right away. But I'm interested to try it out and see how that works.
Yeah, so and I think it's cool to explain how the Scram Express project works, because I was reading the blog post on it, and I was like, okay, I don't understand how this actually runs. And what they're doing is they're taking headless Electron and using that as their server, essentially. And that to me is it's kind of wild. I was like, oh, that's really interesting, and I hadn't even thought of that. But so they're running. It's like they're running kind of a headless Chromium type thing, and that's their server. And then that's what is going through and parsing all their HTML and turning it into Express calls and things like that. So yeah, it's a pretty wild idea when you think about it. Like. You could, I don't know if the Chromium team ever was imagining Chromium being used as a server, like in this particular setup. But yeah, especially because there's a lot of folks that are into universal apps these days, it's kind of an interesting, like, if you kind of squint your eyes, you can be like, I could maybe see how that could happen, like in the future, if we actually like invested in something like that. That could be kind of cool.
Well, I like my servers to run in the cloud at all times. I think if we all get there, we're all better off for it. But that is, from a production standpoint, at the end of the day, it always comes to, can I ship something into production for Justin? When we start to talk about so many of the newer sort of things that come into play, and Rob talked to this as well about the science behind it. Like, we do need data for these sorts of things until we start to see things ship. Our server-side web components, something that you could ship today, would you ship it? Should you? Like, it's there's a fine line, right, of like that greenfield project that's starting out on a lot of these newer technologies. But should we be pulling more data? Should we be shipping these things?
I think what we've seen definitely from working on Shop was, I think all these things are super cool and you can absolutely do them. And probably the biggest thing is just being very conscientious of what that boot up time is for the user so that they're not in that uncanny valley. So you can probably go either way, so long as someone feels like their time to interaction is nice and snappy. There's probably a lot of different techniques that will get you there.
And the stack has grown quite a bit to get you across those techniques. I mean, today we're talking about server-side rendering of web components. Obviously, we have app shells. Streaming is sort of in the horizon of things when in terms of JavaScript and working on data. There's a lot of techniques out there. Some better than others. Some more experimental than others. Should people continue to experiment? Like, hey, just select one and let's all just do one thing forever.
Oh, I think we got to keep experimenting. I mean, honestly, to me, it feels like one of the most fun times to be a web developer, right? It just feels like the doors are being blown open at the moment, and it's pretty cool. Especially around the whole progressive web app thing. I mean, I know our team is super excited about that, and now you have other browsers picking that up. I'm just super excited to see where that goes. I used to play this game. I used to kind of like mess with people on my team because we talk a lot about mobile web and mobile web apps, and I'd be like, all right, but for reals, how many mobile web apps do you have saved to your home screen? And people would be like, and they get like a little, right, they'd be like, maybe I have that weather.io or something, some really good weather app, and that was like the only one. And now I feel like we're actually hitting the point where I've got like, maybe I got like 10 different ones saved to my home screen at this point, all sorts of different things. And new stuff is kind of popping up all the time, and I'm like, that's kind of awesome. So I don't know, man. I feel pretty excited about where we're headed at the moment.
It does amaze me that with so many frameworks and libraries and things out there that, there has been this explosion out there, but it's been a really interesting explosion because everyone's really working towards the same goal, but you really don't have to take the same architectural approach. Like, you can have an approach that works for you and still adhere to the basic general guidelines of performance as a whole. Is performance on the web getting better with things like server-side and app shells and everything else? Are we seeing improvements across the board?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's the balancing act between if you're using a large framework, perhaps, or even, I mean, this could happen if you're just using web components, if you just have like loads and loads that you're trying to bootstrap at the very beginning of your application. So I think what we're trying to do is people are trying to be a little bit smarter about how much they're sending over the wire and when it actually starts getting parsed and boots up. But I think we're starting, I mean, developers are taking performance very seriously. Time to first paint, and on our team, we have the whole Rail model. And I think we're seeing a lot of adoption of that. It's a little slow, but I do think people are getting that into their mindset that is really crucial for a good user experience.
Yeah. Paul Lewis is coming on the show to talk about Rail and performance pretty soon, so that'll be exciting.
Nice.
Trey, what's been your experience with performance with these things?
I've actually had pretty good performance on client rendering. I know there's I've talked to a lot of people who have concerns with performance on client rendering, so I'm just curious as to what the performance is like on the server. I guess there's a couple different aspects to this, just ops per second, how much can you actually render, and then how does that affect the initial render time?
So for me, with server components, at least by and large, it's really very good for performance. The DOM implementation is very quick and lightweight, and you get a bunch of nice performance optimizations available. You can easily cache data between different requests coming in, so that you only make one call off to other stuff, and that's perfectly doable if you're going through the client side and you're going to proxy stuff through your server, but you're adding a bunch of extra complexity, and that's just really easy when you're making just a request to a server that can just pull this stuff together. And yeah, you can just get stuff pulling right through the way through. I've got pages set up with a whole bunch of widgets rendering various stuff, pulling in data from a bunch of sources, managing all this caching, and the whole render time is about 50, 70 milliseconds. And most of that time is pulling together the data and actually formatting it rather than the DOM bit at the top. And I'm fairly sure that's going to be quicker than anything you're doing, even once it's got to the browser. And then you have to send all the JavaScript frameworks back and forth as well.
That's awesome, and that's really huge to be able to do extra work, not just rendering, like caching stuff and pulling stuff in. That's really neat.
Yeah, there's a bunch of benefits to just running in server-side code. It's really easy. Stuff like browser compatibility problems even just sort of disappear. You know exactly what environment your code is going to be running in. You just write ES6. You don't have Babel and stuff getting in the way. You just write things and it just works. And you can test it and you know exactly what you're testing with. You don't have browser environments for logic that you can move to the server side. It's really nice.
Yeah, I can imagine a lot of different ways of thinking about this where you can have dynamic templates similar to the AWD approach for adaptive web design, where you'd have like templates for mobile, templates for tablets. In this case, you'd have template tags for specific custom elements, which is kind of odd, but there's a lot of possibilities, I guess, is my point.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of stuff in this, and yeah, it's all very early, and it's quite fun just experimenting with it. But I'm quite excited to see where it's going to go.
So if I'm building a web component and I'm just using custom elements, could I use your library to just for that one component, or is it built for applications using components?
So it's mostly built for simpler applications, really. So you probably wouldn't want to use it for a really large thing. And for relatively small stuff, it's really, really easy and quick and lightweight. So if you've got a simple custom element and you want to move it to the server, you basically swap out a document.register element for components.register element, and you require server components. And you make sure you return a promise if you're doing asynchronous things and this kind of stuff. So very small tweaks, and then it just works by and large, if the libraries you're depending on also work.
And does it go back and forth through a WebSocket or something where you'd have updates to that component?
So not automatically, it's just doing server-side rendering, but you definitely can start doing that sort of stuff on top. What I'm quite looking forward to is, if, say, you've got a Twitter feed component, that's a fairly nice example, it's really easy to do on a server to just go to Twitter, get a bunch of content, render a bit of HTML. You can then cache the request through to Twitter and even just cache the rendered HTML and just serve it up, and you've suddenly got this chunk of UI that's really, really quick and immediately visible on your page and works perfectly with SEO and accessibility and whatever for anybody. So that's really great. And then you just build small web components on top that look at that and know how to update those components once they're already there. And that's a relatively easy job to do, relatively easy extension to pull in. And you can do WebSockets through or whatever else you like.
Yeah, I think the cool thing about Tim's library is that you could almost imagine it as you're sort of like defining or almost controlling the element in like two places, right? And so as he was mentioning, like you could do some more expensive bits on the server, but then you don't need to necessarily send all that logic down to the client if you don't need it after sort of the initial render. So the JavaScript that you could send down to the client when to sort of bootstrap that element could be really slimmed down. It could be just like some event handlers or what happens when you click on the thing, whereas the server side could be like, let's go fetch a bunch of stuff and stamp it out and do all these other things. So that's kind of a cool way to think about them. I mean, we've been thinking about them primarily as just like, it's a client-side thing, and you're going to have these certain life cycles, and that's just going to be it. But here, you're almost redefining the element when it hits the client. That's kind of nifty.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's I can imagine there's a whole new set of gotchas and a different mindset you'd need to be thinking about this. I mean, even with something like Angular Universal or isomorphic JavaScript in general, there's a whole bunch of gotchas. Is there anything that's different or new when thinking this way, using your library, Tim?
So almost, I think every gotcha I can think of is a general one for server rendering, really. You have to start thinking about the fact that really you're going to want to run code that expects to be running in a browser, and unbeknownst to it, you're going to whip that browser out from under its feet and expect it to kind of still glue together and do the same sort of thing. Particularly with server components, and I suspect anybody doing DOM simulation rather than running a whole WebKit, you don't have layout. So if you're trying to write JavaScript that is going to dynamically actually think about the size of stuff on the page and work out where stuff's going to go, you can't easily do that. You can't actually pull in some of those bits, and that becomes the stuff that you then progressively enhance on the client side. And quite a few libraries will actually expect that they're going to be able to do that. When they're going to work out how they're going to render, they're going to look at how big the element is to decide what to render, and that's not going to make any sense. And I think that's a kind of fundamental conflict. You can't have a really quick DOM simulation and also do all the layout and painting and stuff required to work out the size.
So something that's been kind of interesting that people have been doing with things like Angular Universal and I know with the React server-side rendering as well, is that some people have actually started using these as almost as static site generators. Is that something that you think you could take some of the stuff that you've been doing and do something like that as well?
Yes, definitely. I haven't yet. It's on the list. I had a couple of questions on Twitter from other people quite interested in doing exactly that as well. Web components generally just like a really nice model for these kind of simple transformations, and static sites are perfect for it. And yeah, like, as you say, I've seen a bunch of kind of React, a lot of generators and this kind of stuff. And for that sort of thing, it feels quite big and heavyweight. Having small and simple tools to do these transformations would be really good. But it doesn't exist yet. But it will, probably.
But it will. That's really cool because that use case I actually like a lot, because you think of you have a company and you have your company website or something like that maybe is WordPress or maybe is something else, but maybe it is just a static site. And I know a lot of blogs are a lot of people that do blogs use Jekyll and other static site generators for stuff like that. But being able to take, especially if you're trying to keep that same like theme and stuff like that, being able to build your blog or your just information site out of the same sets of components that you're using to build your more interactive sites or apps is really cool.
Yeah. Hopefully, what I'd really like is for us to get to a place where everything's really working on web components as a standard for this stuff, and you can start moving it from static offline generation to server generation to client generation, and just go back and forth to wherever is appropriate for whichever bit of logic you're doing, or however frequently you want to have this component updating, and start having other libraries building on the same standards so that you can have some React components and move them around similarly and this kind of stuff. And it's a way away, but hopefully we'll get there.
Cool. So I thought that was my last question, and then so I was just lying to myself. So again, so you have something that is supposed to be running in the browser environment, and so now you're saying, like, okay, so now we've got it running in a server in a certain way, and now we're getting it running in potentially running in like a static site generator or something like that. What about things like web workers or service workers?
Yeah, so you mean what about running them server-side? Because, yeah, that's...
Well, no.
There's APIs that are just not going to work there.
No, so not running them server-side, but actually rendering, quote-unquote, rendering a custom element in a web worker or a service worker and having just it would have to be a string, but having that string of what the DOM looks like sent back from one of the workers.
Yes. So yeah, you're going to have to use strings as your communication medium between them, but actually doing that in practice, yeah, should work quite nicely. Yeah, it'd be really interesting. I haven't seen anybody playing with that yet. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff with how, like particularly with service workers, how this kind of stuff interacts with that, and the kind of upcoming progressive web apps. Like what happens when you start server rendering stuff and you want to move more towards offline services, this sort of thing. But yeah, there's a lot of scope for interesting things there that I haven't seen anybody touching.
I have a feeling you were just talking to the guy who's playing with that. I don't know.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to see where that's going.
Oh, definitely. So, is there any other things that we haven't covered, or anything we should know about the state of server-side web components in your library or in general?
No, I think that's pretty much it. It's still fairly early days. I'm still playing with lots of different ways this works, but it works quite well just as a really simple way of getting those kind of not that nice front end composing together stuff while still just being able to quickly do it on the server. It works really well.
Actually, there's one thing I wanted to share before we head out, just because it's top of mind, and I think it's really important, which is that so Tim's library is primarily using vanilla custom elements, and I think a lot of developers don't realize that there is a vanilla custom elements polyfill that is out there. It's really small, 6.5K gzipped. It's a little hard to find though. So if you want to actually play around with this polyfill, you got to go to the Web Components.js repo on GitHub, and you got to go to the releases section, and you go to like whatever the current release is, and that's where they actually build all the polyfills. And hopefully we can maybe like share a link to that in the show notes. But for people who maybe aren't ready to go all in on something like Polymer or something like that, maybe they just want to kind of take kind of like a baby step into the world of web components. Custom elements is great, and the polyfill has really good browser support, and really it's a very easy thing to polyfill, so it's very performant. And that's what I've been secretly like trying to get all my other Chrome DevRel people into it. So Paul Lewis and people like that, maybe they tend to not really like to use any sort of framework or library. They want to just deal with their own code. But sort of the thing that I've gotten them into is just using the custom elements polyfill, because it is a standard, it is shipping soon in all the browsers, and it's pretty small overhead. So I would just say if anybody is listening and kind of interested in the topic, but maybe been cautious about diving into it, maybe just give that polyfill a shot, see if you like playing around with that.
I agree.
And the V1 polyfill actually isn't that far off, is it, Rob?
Correct. So one of our teammates, Justin, is working on that right now. And the difference between, I mean, there's totally API difference between V0 and V1, but most of it is just like renaming and things like that. I mean, it's in terms of how they work, they'll be pretty similar. So yeah, hopefully that'll roll out soon as well. And the V1 polyfill I like, or the V1 spec I should say, I like in particular because it has this one little feature which I really dig, which is you can check to see if an element has upgraded yet, and it will return a promise. That's been something that a lot of people have struggled with, because they're like, how do I know when my light DOM children or something are ready? And it's like, I don't know, check a property on them or something. Like we've never really had like the best answer for that. And so now you can just like get a promise, and you could collect all those promises and say, promise.all, okay, I know that like all my children are ready, now I can do something.
And I think that one's like 500 lines of code or something like that, so it's a bit more approachable too.
It's huge, 500.
Gigante.
It's probably like
little.
1 byte or something. It's going to be small though. So I looked on the releases under the Web Components.js. We'll definitely get a link. I couldn't find the separate ones, but we'll find it and I'll put it in there.
Oh yeah, I can share that. Yeah.
All right, so I think that's it. Maybe in a few months or so we do another one of these.
No, we've solved all the problems. It's done.
Maybe when when Edge has ShadowDom implemented in its build. It's not preview. we'll definitely.
I think we just throw a party for everything, for every API that ships. I think that's the solid way to go. Global parties, shipping more APIs.
Yes.
I like it. Any reason for that stuff. I'm not gonna lie. Once custom elements are 100%. I'll pretty much use browsers. I actually think there should be a celebration, because that's crazy.
Yeah, we should do like a remote conference on this or something.
Considering where we were 3 or 4 years ago or something like that, it's absolutely insane.
It's been a long haul.
Rob just looks tired as I mentioned it.
All right, let's wrap up then. Tim, Rob, Trey, thank you guys for coming. Justin, Danny, but thanks anyway. Rob, could you just tell us your Twitter and how people can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's Rob_Dodson, Dodson. Find me on the Twitters.
Okay, and Trey?
Treshugart. So my name minus the Y all run together.
Nice. It's coming on 5 a.m. for you over there, man. I feel bad.
Oh, 4:30. It's all good.
Tim?
So, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, on GitHub and Twitter, I'm Pimterry, Pimterry.
Not to confuse us too much. And we'll have links to a lot of the stuff that we talked about, especially your repository, as well as the one that Jordan had created and his article. We can put the custom elements in, and if there's anything else, we'll add that. But thank you guys for coming. This has been episode number 98, Server-Side Web Components.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at +the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Eric Isaacson at eIsaacson
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.